the herald angels sing. And I gotta tell you, I'm a bit nervous. I'd rather hear a guitar play and Olga stand next to me. Because last time we sang, there's so many of us up here, it was much easier. Now it's kind of scary, I gotta admit. But you know what? This is who we are. And this is how we are. And Jesus said, come just as you are. So we did.
Is it ready? All right, thank you. So how was Christmas?
Fun.
Was it good?
Fun.
All right, what do you think I got in my suitcase today? You're always hoping for candy, aren't you? Yeah, it's not candy. Sorry about that. Let's see, I got a brick. Okay. I'll just leave it there. And we got a container of sand. Now, let me ask you something. If you were going to build something, like a house, which would you rather build it on? The brick or the sand?
Brick.
Why?
Because the brick is stronger than the sand.
That's right. Anybody else, why would you build it on the brick rather than sand? Yeah, because look, if I take my pen and I go like that, it doesn't go through the brick, does it? What if I go like that with the sand? Right through it. And there's a story in the Bible about that we're supposed to make sure we build our lives on solid foundations, and that means something very strong that can hold them, but not the sand, because, if the rain comes and washes away the sand, then the house collapses, but it can't wash away the brick. You understand that? So what's the solid foundation we're supposed to build our lives on? On the strong, but who's the strong thing the Bible's talking about? Jesus, that's right. And that means we not only say we love Jesus, but we act like him and live like him. And there was a guy who wasn't a whole lot older than the oldest of you here. And he had to be strong. You know what this is? Okay, it's a sling. Now every time I take this out, my wife worries that I'm going to swing it around and hit one of you out there. So I'm not going to do it because I wouldn't want to do that. Yes, I did make it. And do you know who the guy was that used one of these? Don't worry, I'm not going to swing it at you. Who was it? David, that's right. David was a young guy, maybe a very young teenager, like some of you who are here. And there was a whole country, Israel, that was being threatened by another country, and they were going to try to kill them all. But they had a giant in that country, probably 8 feet tall. And he kept coming out and saying, look, I'll just fight one of your people, and if I win, then you become our slaves. And David said, do you remember what David said when he went to fight him? Huh? That's exactly what he said. God is bigger than you. And so he just took this sling and he held it like this. Now you're all looking worried. I won't swing it any more than that. And then he let go of one end of it, and the rock went sailing through the air about as fast as a bullet, and it hit the giant right in the head, and it killed him, the forehead, right there. It says it sunk into his head, and he fell on his face dead. But do you think that was pretty courageous, pretty important that David did that? What if the life of a whole country depended on one of you? What would you do? What? Yeah, see, what God wants us to do is recognize our country depends on us and how we treat other people and how much we love them. And if we're willing to stand up for God and stand on the solid foundation of the brick, but a lot of us are standing on sand because we stand on what we hear in the news, and we stand on the fact that we're told we've got to be rich, and we've got to be good looking, and we've got to know a lot, and we've got to be in charge of everything. And God says there's only one thing we have to do, and what's that? Be good. That's a good start. What else? Worship Him? Believe Him? Good. It's good stuff. We've got to do what God tells us to do. And be like Him. That's right. You got good answers today. And to do that, what do we have to do to be like God? Exactly. We need to read and study the Bible to know what He wants us to do. Okay? So I'm going to let you go now to your children's church. Okay? All right. Come on, guys. Here, you got to help me up, man. Don't just walk away. Okay, there. I can't get up without your help. I'm dependent on you. You had some good answers there today. Today's sermon is the last one on the series on the Sermon on the Mount. And it's one of those things that can be fairly easily misunderstood. The scriptures you're going to read in just a minute are the last section of it, but when it's talking about the sermon, Wade, happy birthday! It's Wade's birthday today.
Happy birthday, Wade!
He's the one who came and got us started on the parking lots, and I appreciate that very much. So anyway, the Sermon on the Mount starts in the 5th chapter of Matthew, and it starts with what we call the Beatitudes or the blessings. And the blessings are basically, you know, in front of a book there's a table of contents, and that tells you what each chapter is. Well, the Sermon on the Mount kind of, with the Beatitudes and the blessings, is what that is about. It's telling us what's going to be in the rest of the sermon. And I just want to read a couple of them, but they're important for us to understand, because these kids were talking about to be like Jesus and understand the Bible to be like Jesus. And this is what he's saying to us in the table of contents, to be like Jesus. He said, blessed are the poor in spirit. What does that mean? Does that mean that, oh me, I'm a horrible person? No. Poor in spirit means that I recognize that I'm not everything and the most important thing. I'm humble about things. And he says as a result of that, ours is going to be the kingdom of heaven, because God can actually talk to us and we can hear him if we're that way. And then it goes on and says, blessed are those who mourn. And that's not a sad thing. What it's talking about is those people who are compassionate and caring enough of people who don't know God. That we're sad that our friends don't know God and that our family members don't know God. And when we're sad about that, it should motivate us to do something with it. So it says they're going to be comforted, because if they're open with people about God, some people will come to God, and that will cheer them up. And it says, blessed are the meek, and that's simply humility. Have you ever known anybody who wasn't humble? Who just thought they were about the greatest thing that ever was? And you know what? God's not going to trust those with his kingdom, because they're going to do what they want with it. And when he says, blessed are the meek, he says, they will inherit the earth. And the reason they will inherit the earth is because they can be trusted to take care of it. Because they're not going to be saying, look, I can do anything I want with this. They're going to be saying, wow, what a privilege. What would God want me to do with that? And then he goes on a little further down and he says, blessed are the pure in heart, for they will see God. It's going to be hard to see God if we are bragging about things, if we're angry at people all the time, if we're scared all the time that somebody won't like us. So when he says you're pure in heart, you just trust God that he has given us value and said, you are important enough to me to die for you, to take your place and die for you. And the result of that is that what's going to happen if we're pure in heart? We're going to see God. In other words, we're going to have greater access to God. We're going to be able to be more in contact with and know, like those little kids were saying, that we need to be like him. But we can't be like him if we can't see him. You know what we do instead of that? We look at the way we want him to be and then say it's okay for me to be like that. And instead of being created in God's image, we're starting to recreate him in our image. And that's got it way, way backwards. And then he goes on and says, blessed are the peacemakers, because they're going to be called the children of God. Why are we going to be called the children of God if we're peacemakers? Oh, you're so responsive like the children. Why would we be called peacemakers? Or why would we, what's a peacemaker? Okay, I guess I'm going to have to tell you. It says they're going to be the sons or daughters of God, and that means we're going to be doing what Jesus does himself. He came as a peacemaker to take away the fear, to take away the misunderstanding, to do all that, to take away the confusion, to take away the obsessions, and it goes on and on. But to be a peacemaker, what's the first thing you got to do?
Love.
What's the first thing you got to do?
Love.
You got to love. And that means you're going to do it the way God does it. Because love is the most misunderstood word in the English language. We use it for all sorts of things. But this is a kind of love that talks about sacrifice and giving himself and being more than we've ever been before. And as a result of that, if we're peacemakers, we will be said, you're like my son Jesus. You're my son, my daughter. And that's what's right. And finally, he said, blessed are those who are persecuted for righteousness, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. And that's the David story. That's the David story. There's this whole nation led by this giant out there in front of them. And the whole Israeli army is afraid to confront him. He says, look, there's the giant says, there's no need all of us getting killed and all of them getting killed. Let me just fight one of your guys, and if you win, we'll be your slaves. And if we win, you'll be our slaves. And this kid comes along and says, this guy's not bigger than God. This is what we were told by one of the children. God's bigger than him, so why are we afraid? And so the king, King Saul at the time, says, okay, no one else is going to do it. We'll let this little guy do it. But we're going to make him look powerful. So Saul puts his armor on him and gives him his spear and his sword. Saul was a big man. And David couldn't hardly walk around in it. It was just weighing him down. He says, I'm not comfortable in this. So he takes it all off and just wearing his shepherd's clothes goes out there with this sling like I had. And we think, well, that's almost a toy. Do you know that there's one place in the Bible that says when the army of Israel came together against the Philistines, it listed the people who were spearmen and sword throwers and over 10,000 slingmen, people who only used those. Those were like the bullets of the day. And so David goes and the guy says, I'm going to feed you to the birds. And David says, no, you're not. And he runs toward the guy and swings this thing around like a bullet right in the forehead. And that was the end. And that's what we're supposed to do, but we can't do it if we're not peacemakers, because that's saying, I will stand up for God, I will trust persecution, and I will do the right thing no matter what happens, and as a result of that, I will be called a child of God. As a result of that, the kingdom of heaven will be open to me. As a result of that kind of faith and trust and risking for God, I'll get to see God. And so we have a story that's the last part of the Sermon on the Mount. And I would challenge you, and I know I do this for things all the time, and I never hear that anybody actually took me up on it, but I will challenge you to go home and for the next week, read the Sermon on the Mount, Matthew 5, 6, and 7, at least 3 times within the next week. And ask yourself not what does it say about what Jesus was doing and teaching, but what does it say to me? Because if you look at the content, it's all there. It's all there for the way we're to live our lives. Let me read this last section. It's 7:24 through 29. And here's what it says. Matthew 7:24 through 29. Jesus is teaching, and he uses a parable, and it's important that we understand what the parable was talking about, not looking at the parable as an actual story, but it's a lesson. Therefore, he says, and the therefore has to do with everything he said in these last 3 chapters. He says, therefore, everyone who hears these words of mine and puts them into practice is like the wise man. He built his house on the rock. The rains came down, the streams rose, the wind blew, and it beat against the house, and yet it did not fall because it had its foundation on the rock. But everyone who hears these words of mine and does not put them into practice is like the foolish man who built his house on sand, and the rain came down, the streams rose, the wind blew and beat against the house, and it fell with a great crash. It fell with a great crash. Verse 28. When Jesus had finished saying these things, The crowd was amazed at his teaching because he taught as one who had authority and not just like their regular teachers of the law. And that's what he wants us to hear when we hear about his scripture, when we hear the sermons about it, when we read it ourselves. He wants us to hear the voice of Jesus having authority. And that's what he wants us to hear, is him speaking to us. Now, it's important that we understand as we look at this parable a number of things. In the very second word of what I read, it says everyone. And what he's saying is everyone who hears. That doesn't mean that everybody's going to hear what I say today. And that doesn't mean that everybody in the audience there would hear what he was saying, because some of those people were just there to try to prove him wrong. So they're going to only hear what they want to hear. But he says everybody who really listens to me, and these words that are mine, he doesn't say these words of the Torah. He doesn't say these words of the tradition of the Jewish nation. He doesn't say these words that I'm used to hearing, but he says, these words of mine, I am the Son of God speaking to you right now, and hear that. He says, everybody who hears them and puts them into practice is like a wise man. He's not talking about success. Do you realize that? He's not talking about acceptance. He's not talking about someone saying, wow, you're a good public speaker. You ought to go on the motivational circuit. That's not what he's saying. What he is saying, however, is you're a wise man because you know what your life is supposed to be about. You know the way you were created to live if you hear these words. And when that happens, no 8-foot giant, no rainstorm, no earthquake, and no criticism by family or friends or other people can shake you. Because you're standing solidly on that brick and you can't be moved. And that's what a wise man does. And the storm can't do anything to it. But he also says, everyone who hears my words but doesn't put them into practice. In other words, everybody who distorts the word. There are so many things, and I'm not going to go into it right now, but there are so many things that I could say that I'm not going to, because the world we live in is a mess. It's really a mess. Morality has gone down the tubes. Respect for one another because we want what we want has gone down the tubes. Truth has gone down the tubes. And I'm not trying to be negative, but I'm trying to be real. And unless we're real, we're not going to make a difference. Unless we're real, we're not going to say, where is that sling so I can stand up against these things and knock it down. Anything that we see with our eyes and comes into our mind is going to have an effect on us. And right now, most of what we see and hear has nothing to do with God. Christmas really has very little to do with God for many, many people, most of the people in the world. Easter has very little to do. I just don't see how you hook Jesus and a bunny together. But we do that. You know. And so he says, if you're not going to do these things, if you're not going to put them into action, you're standing on sand. How many of you ever been in an earthquake? A number of you. Betty Lee and I have been in, we're from Southern California, and we've been in several of them. And it's a scary thing when the world is shaking under you. It's a very scary thing. When I was a teenager and living with my grandparents, there was a big earthquake that destroyed a big women's prison and destroyed a lot of stuff in Central California. And I was sleeping in their den, and I looked and I felt things moving, and I looked and I saw a table lamp moving across the table and then crashed off of it. And that was scary for a young kid. That was scary. And I could give you several other examples of earthquakes. This is what he's saying. You're standing in a fault area and can expect an earthquake if you don't pay attention to this. There's nothing solid you can stand on. And he's saying that's where you are emotionally, and that's where you are spiritually, that's where you are intellectually, and finally it will get to you physically. Finally it will get to you physically. So he not only says those things, but he goes on and he says that the problem here is that to you I will sound like a radical. Jesus was a radical, okay? And he's even more radical today if we let him live and hear him. And the scary thing he's saying, and I want you to be radical too. We had a good Christmas Eve service here, and we shared it with the Hispanic congregation that meets here in the afternoon. And the first guy who shared, because it's an unplanned thing, we just are there to be a gift to Jesus and to share with him what he's done. And this young man, he had played the accordion on a song just before that, and he stood right over here. And he said, God has been telling me I've got to start telling people about Jesus. And I was downtown and I saw a guy laying on the street, and I went to talk to him about Jesus, and I could see him change. And I could see him become joyous. And then he said, I was going away and I saw an African-American man sitting over there. He was a down and outer. And he said, God said, go tell him about Jesus. And I was afraid. And I left. And I went across the bridge and across the river. And he said, the next day I saw a newspaper. And that man was killed that night. And I hadn't shared Jesus with him. He could have made the difference between heaven and hell for the man. That's radical. When God tells us to do it, we're supposed to do it. And this is what he's talking about here. Because we don't know. All we know is what God wants us to do if we are hearing the words the way he's saying them, not the way we want him to say them. It was a very touching thing, and there was a lot of other sharing like that night. And it was a wonderful thing. So as we continue to look at this parable, it's clear. He's saying, if you want to know truth, you've got to really listen no matter what your background or your tradition is. The reason the Pharisees and the Sadducees and the Sanhedrin wanted to kill Jesus wasn't because he wasn't preaching truth. It was that he was not upholding their tradition and the way they saw things. And as a result of that, they had to get rid of him because he was becoming more popular than them. Sounds like a presidential election, doesn't it? Let's destroy the opponent. Now let's see who's going to do the best and be the most helpful. And that's what it's become. It's become a culture of blame rather than a culture of solutions. We've got to find out who's wrong rather than changing it and making the solution right. And this is what he said. And then Jesus, after that, says these words. It says, when Jesus finished saying these things, the crowd was amazed at his teaching. If we really hear God and the Scripture and compare it to where we live right now in this culture, it's going to be amazing what he's saying and what he wants us to do. You know, how many times have you heard in the last year somebody saying, I never thought a tragedy like that would come to my neighborhood or my school or my state. Read the paper the other morning. We live in the Montevilla area. Gunshots in the Montevilla area. And I thought that immediately. I never thought I'd get that close. We didn't hear the gunshots. Nobody was hurt. But just the idea that there were gang-related people shooting at each other in our area, it's kind of scary. And the only way that's going to change is not that we wait until it comes to our neighborhood, but that we prevent it from coming to our neighborhood by making a difference. One of the things I love about this church is you people are making a difference. The Hispanic congregation were practicing because they're going to have a service today, and then they're going to have a New Year's Eve party here, or New Year's Eve service. And there was a young to middle-aged man walking across the parking lot and having a lot of difficulty. It seems to be one that has some probably emotional issues. And he heard the music. And I don't know if it was Kevin or who said, "Do you want to go inside?" And he went and he sat in one of the benches out here, and I went and talked to him. Got him some coffee. People seem to like coffee. I offer that to everybody. I don't like it myself, but they do. And I said, "Can I do anything for you?" He said, "No, I just want to listen to the music." And he sat here for a long time, well over an hour, just to hear them sing. And that seemed to bring peace and calm to him. The door was open. He was asked by one of you to come in. And he did, and it was awful. This is what being like Jesus is about. This is what building your life on the solid foundation is about. And it's very interesting because when it talks about solid foundation, it's talking about building on a rock. And I don't know if you remember, you probably do, that Jesus is talking to his disciples, and he says to them, "Who do people say that I am?" And some of the disciples said different answers. Some say you're a prophet, some say that you're John the Baptist coming back. And then he says, "Who do you say that I am?" And that's a question I'd just like to ask you for a moment to think in your mind. Who do you really say Jesus is? Is it just, "Oh, I believe in Jesus and so I'm saved"? That takes care of it? Nope. Or is it, "Wow, I don't want to go to hell, so just in case it's true, I'll say I believe, so I won't go"? Or is it that I believe that when I trust Jesus, my life will totally change and I will be a different person? And as those of you who know my story know, that's my testimony. A wholly different person. And unless it's that, we're on the sand, folks. We're on the sand. So anyway, Peter says, in answer to who people say that I am, he says, "You are the Christ, the Son of the living God." And Jesus responds by saying, "You know what? Your intellect didn't give you that information. That came from God." And then he says to Peter, "And on the basis of your testimony that I am the Christ, on that rock," he calls it, "I will build my church." And what he's saying is, I will build my church on that piece of brick we've been talking about. And it will be solid and it can't be moved. Because that's who God sent me to be. And if that's who Jesus is for you, then there's a lot of hope and there's a lot of good stuff in the future. Because in Matthew 28, Jesus says, "All authority has been given to me on heaven and earth." In other words, God has given me everything that I need to do what? What do you give him authority to do? I hope some of you know the answer and aren't just saying it. I mean, I'm just afraid to say it. What do you give him authority to do?
Everything.
Heal the sick and
Everything, that's part of it. Fits in there. He gave him, Jesus, the authority to save us from being separated from God and going to hell.
yes.
He's the only one and the only way to not be separated from God. That's a pretty heavy burden. I mean, I think it's heavy enough that he had authority to do that for me. Because I certainly wasn't that wonderful a person. And I know the backgrounds in some of you, and some of you weren't that wonderful people either. But that's what he gave him authority to do. And not only did he give him authority to do that, but then Jesus says, what?
He'll give us the authority.
Exactly. Jesus said, now I'm passing that on to you. I'm going to leave this world, and as I have represented God to you, now I want you to represent God to the rest of the world. And unless we know Christ as our Lord and Savior, we're going to have a hard time doing that. We may be good people, we may be nice people. But we're going to have a hard time doing that because we don't have the message that's going to keep people in God's kingdom. We don't have that message. And so Jesus, when he's talking about this and when he was finished, and they were so amazed that he spoke with authority, and the thing that amazed them was he was different than all the other teachers. He wasn't trying to get anything for himself. He was trying to get something for us. And they hadn't heard that before. They had heard about laws, and unless you act this way and this way and this way, and don't walk that far on the Sabbath, and don't heal anybody on the Sabbath. Unless you do all of these things, you can't get in. It was all about works. There was no grace involved. But it's about grace. Because none of us can work hard enough or do well enough to get the job done. I know hell is not a popular word to use nowadays. But it is what it means to be separated from God. I don't know what that's going to be like, because I believe the analogies about hell and heaven are parables to help us understand how great they are, how bad they are. And the worst thing I could think of ever would to be in a setting with other people that didn't care about anything but themselves. Can you imagine a whole kingdom of that? That's scary. That's scary. And yet that's what it is. That's what separation from God is, because there's nothing good there. But being with God has more to do with being in love with everything and everybody, and being loved by God and cared for by God has a lot more to do with that than it has to do with silver and gold. Do you realize that? The statement that the street's going to be of gold simply says that gold has no value to God, so he's using it for asphalt. You know, and that's what it's about. Because it's the relationship, not the thing that we can hold and touch, not the gifts that we got. It's the gift of salvation. It's the gift of the love of God. It says in Matthew 10 that Jesus called his disciples together, and he gave them authority over evil spirits. Anything that's evil, that's bad, we have authority over. It can't touch us if we trust God to keep it from us. Healing, not just the gift of that, but the authority to bring healing to people. And even though there's a lot of people we talked about this morning that need physical healing, and we need to be praying for them, there are more people, and some of us here, that need emotional and psychological healing. They need to get past the effects of our childhood, or what someone has said to us and done something to us. To get past all of that, and that's the most important healing. And you do that by loving people. I used to do a seminar called Loving People into Health. And it was about that. And some of you have helped do that for people that have come through here. Some of you have helped do that for people who have come as court mandates and they've gotten to know you. That's what it's talking about, the healing. But he gave authority not just to the disciples, but to everybody who has become his disciple, become his servant, wants to do things for him. And it says we can even have the power to chase away the evil spirits, to drive them out. And we can, because they can't exist where God is. And if we're pure of heart, as that beatitude said, they can't get close to us. They're going to be off there in the distance shouting at you. I've had a few people driving by me and thought I did something wrong, and had a few words for me and some gestures that weren't very, very kind. But they weren't close enough to do any harm to me. And there will be people out there, because we have faith in God, shouting those things and doing those gestures. But they can't touch us. And the way to keep it from affecting us is to just say, oh, I'll pray for you, man. I feel sorry for you. I feel bad for you that you're that way. Because if we let them get to us, it's like taking our emotions out of our head and handing it to them and saying, control my emotions. And that's a crazy thing to do. That's a crazy thing to do. And so, in conclusion, are we up to the challenge to stand on the rock and not move off of it? If a message would come to us right now from God saying the whole world has fallen apart, and I'm counting on this group of you gathered here today to change the world, are we up to doing it? It's got to start someplace. It started with one man born as a baby, just like us. And the world has been different ever since then. But those who are against him are trying to execute him just like Herod did, emotionally and everything. Are we willing to stand up? Are we willing to say, here it is? Are we ready to change the world? Let's pray. Well then, I think we ought to stand up and throw our voices out for Jesus, just like David threw those rocks. So let's sing out. This is a good song. Very good. Amen.
Yeah, I was just like, wait, hand me the pure.
Go tell it on the mountains, over the hills and everywhere. Go tell it on the mountains that Jesus Christ is born. While shepherds kept their watching, or silence marks by night, behold, throughout the heavens there shone a holy light. Go tell it on the mountains, over the hills and everywhere. Go tell it on the mountains that Jesus Christ is born. The shepherds feared and trembled when low above the earth rang out the angels' chorus that hailed our Savior's birth. Go tell it on the mountains, over the hills and everywhere. Go tell it on the mountains that Jesus Christ is born. Down in the lowly manger, that humble Christ was born, and brought us God's salvation, that blessed Christmas morn. Go tell it on the mountains, over the hills and everywhere. Go tell it on the mountains that Jesus Christ is born. Go tell it on the mountains, over the hills and everywhere.